Welcome to today's session, Countering Gender Stereotyping, the Media's Role and Connections with Regulatory Frameworks. I'm Joyce Barnathan, President of the International Center for Journalists, and I will be your moderator. First of all, I want to thank all the groups that co-hosted this session: CFI, Fundación Hirondelle, FPU, IMS, Sempra Media, and of course, GFMD, the Global Forum for Media Development, which I've been proud to be part of for many years. In particular, I have to thank Free Press Unlimited's Flora Schultz-Nordholt for organizing this session and doing so much to help me personally make this, I hope, a very enriching discussion. Please be aware that there will be some translation here, interpretation. So if you go to the bottom of your screen and put the language that you speak on there, whether it's English, Spanish, or whatever, you will be able to hear the translation very effectively. In this session, we're going to explore gender stereotyping and the role the media play in creating and countering it. Gender stereotyping has a large impact on how women and other represented individuals are perceived in society, and therefore on the opportunities that they receive for full and effective participation in public life. As we all know, traditionally women have been portrayed as caregivers or victims and dependents, while men are often portrayed as independent, professional leaders. And these types of images can shape cultural expectations about the role gender plays in society, often excluding women from full participation in public life. Now, there has been some progress, but women, unfortunately, are still heavily underrepresented in media all over the world. Recent findings from the Global Media Monitoring Project that is conducted every 5 years show that the news media remain far from being inclusive spaces for women, vulnerable women, and marginalized groups. One hint of progress, this is good news, was that 48% of televised news is now being reported by women, as opposed to 38% in 2015. However, the results of this project, they have, and in 80 of the 120 participating countries, indicates that while there is some progress on some indicators, women are sorely lacking as subjects and sources in the news, and that's especially the case for marginalized women. The study found that women are subjects or sources of the news only about 26% of the time, and that's across the board in the news media. And I mean newspapers, TV, online, radio, making women and women's voices shockingly underrepresented in global coverage. It's also interesting, in a year where COVID-19 dominated the world news, preliminary results show that on the internet, women were even less visible in stories related to the pandemic than in non-COVID news. And that was certainly the case in Latin America and Asia. And only 1 in 3 health specialists cited on TV news were women. So the preliminary results bring a ray of hope, an increase, for example, in female reporters, but overall they show that today's newsmakers are still overwhelmingly male. The data underscores the importance of this year's Commission on the Status of Women's theme, and this is the theme: women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. Without an equal and inclusive representation in and on the news media, women will not be seen as equally capable leaders, experts, and participants in public life. The need for this inclusive, gender-sensitive content is urgent, and that's why the agreed conclusions by the Commission, and they'll be adopted tomorrow, include various references and recommendations in regard to gender stereotyping, calling on member states and the media to take responsibility in eliminating it. On the one hand, the Commission stresses the important role of the media in achieving gender equality and the empowerment of women in all their diversity, including through non-discriminatory and gender-sensitive coverage and the elimination of gender stereotypes. On the other hand, there is a lack and a clear need of some sort of regulatory framework to eliminate structural barriers to ensure that public life is inclusive of the participation of women in all areas, by providing fair and balanced coverage of women and men candidates and office holders. There is a need to develop strategies to eliminate gender stereotypes and foster the portrayal of women as leaders and decision makers in all areas by developing and implementing proper legislation, policies, or programs. It's also essential to fund and support awareness and public information campaigns with positive images of women and girls in all of their diversity and roles in public life to help eliminate deeply rooted gender inequalities and stereotypes. In this context, we will explore the interplay of the media and policymakers in tackling gender stereotyping. And in particular, we're going to look for synergies and pragmatic solutions. Ultimately, this is an issue that needs the cooperation of both the media and policymakers to effectively counter stereotyping and empower women. So now let me show you or share with you a short video that highlights the effects of gender stereotyping in a local context, in this case, Mali. And after that, I'll introduce the speakers and we'll dive into the discussion.
Le studio CIFOC, en tant que média, peut servir de porte-parole aux jeunes victimes de stéréotypes de genre. Sont souvent les frères, les oncles, les hommes de la famille. Par rapport à cela, notre rôle est de donner la parole aux femmes, aux hommes, aux anthropologues, aux juristes, aux associations de femmes. Bref, tous les acteurs concernés pour permettre aux femmes de bénéficier des mêmes droits que les hommes dans les successions en tant qu'enfants et héritiers.
Studio Tamani a une rédaction jeune, dynamique et inclusive. Autant la hiérarchie tient compte de la représentativité des femmes lors des recrutements, autant leur représentativité est prise en compte dans les différentes productions. La problématique GER ne concerne pas que les femmes, les jeunes et les autres couches marginalisées sont aussi concernées. À cet effet, nous avons un programme produit par les jeunes et pour les jeunes. Il s'agit du programme Jeunes diffusé tous les week-ends, les samedis et dimanches. Concernant l'adoption d'une loi contre les violences basées sur le genre, c'est difficile de dire exactement qu'aujourd'hui, le Mali a une loi spécifique en la matière. À chaque fois que les autorités essaient d'en adopter, le projet échoue pour des perceptions religieuses. Par contre, nous avons le problème.
Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to mention that there will be room for audience questions. So please use the chat to post your questions, and I will do my very best to address them towards the end of the session. Now, over to our speakers. As I mentioned earlier, we want to look at the personal experiences that our speakers have had with gender stereotyping and explore what to do about it. Chiara Adamo has been working at the European Commission for 20 years, where she is currently head of the Human Rights, Gender and Democratic Governance Unit in the Directorate General for International Partnerships. Her group provides support on democracy for developing countries and implements a human rights-based approach to development. Chiara, why don't you kick us off and talk about why this issue is of importance to you personally? What's been your personal experience with gender stereotyping?
Thank you very much for having me. I think as I experienced a lot of what you mentioned in your introduction. I think that all through our projects and all through our programs in the world, gender stereotyping in the media is something that really has a potential to have a transformational change for bringing gender equality and women and girls empowerment. We cannot underestimate the role that the media can play in the negative and in the positive. And in particular, I mean, I think media should really be ahead of the curve and make sure that really follow and harness all the, the positive change and transformational change towards equality and gender equality, which is out there. And unfortunately, what I observe from my personal experience is that media stereotyping cuts across still three main issues: media governance, media content, and also, very worryingly, the situation of women journalists, which is affected by the stereotyping. So the first point, very briefly, on media governance, you touched upon it. There is an improvement, but we see all over the world, even in Europe, that participation of women in the media is still too low. So we have 3/4 of the managerial positions in the media sector which are occupied by men. On media content, women's stories indeed need to be more visible in the media. And despite the progress, just 1 in 5 experts interviewed by news media, the news media in particular, are women. So I really believe that attaining a better balance will also make sure that we have an information which is more plural, diverse, and really looks at the perspective of the society. I have one last figure on this to make. In Burkina Faso, we are having a project together with the FPU, the project Media for Democracy, and we published a report on media and gender there, looking at the gender stereotypes in media content. And the report found very interesting conclusions. The first is 19% of the sources used in stories are women, so only 19%. So the women voices and perspective, of course, are undervalued, are less visible. And in terms of the sector, women's voices were most heard in stories about the economy. So 39% of stories related to economy were female stories, while the male voices dominate the politics and the government. So there, only 10% of the sources were women. So I find it's quite interesting for the discussion going forward. And last point on the safety of journalists and female journalists. I mean, of course, you mentioned it, COVID, and last year has been a particularly terrible year. And it has worsened a situation of harassment and widespread violence against journalists overall. But women are particularly targeted, and we really see it also, through our support programs to individual journalists, that women suffer from multiple threats, from cyber, hate speech online, all different forms of harassment, up to sexual violence. And of course, this creates a vicious circle in terms of self-censorship and shrinking this public space for the women. What can we do there? Just 1 minute, maybe.
We'll talk about what we can do later.
Okay, so very good.
But that really did help set the framework for a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. It's funny. I was a correspondent for a good part of my career, and I honestly hate to admit this, but I never thought about the sources that I was interviewing, and I just very naturally went to, of course, the traditional experts out there, and they were mainly men. And a little embarrassed to admit that now. Like, why wasn't I thinking more deliberately about this? But I think you can think about it more deliberately, which is one of the things we can talk about a little later. And I did want to, without sounding too promotional, my organization just did a research study on online attacks against the renowned Filipino-American journalist Maria Ressa. And the findings are absolutely horrific. And she's not alone. She says she's the canary in the coal mine. So this is a very, very big topic. I don't think it's a topic we're going to focus on today because I think there are other panels that are dealing with it, but it's definitely a huge issue, and I'm glad you brought it up. Muchinraya Alaka, I'm going to move to you next. I hope I pronounced that right. Leads the Wole Soyinka Center for Investigative Journalism, and a pioneering organization in promoting investigative journalism in Nigeria. And over the past 10 years, she's developed programs to train more than 730 reporters and inspired publications with some 170 human interest reports on issues relating to girls and women. She was instrumental in the creation of the Report Women program and its Female Reporters Leadership program. She also produced a documentary called Report Women: Untold Stories of Girls and Women in Nigeria. Mutinrayo, I wanted to speak with you in particular because you're in the newsroom. What's been your personal experience in Nigeria with gender stereotyping?
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you to Free Press Unlimited. I'm happy to be here with other panelists. So personally, I go to the newsroom a lot. Although my major work is not as a journalist directly, my major work is to train journalists. And but I'll start with a personal experience of stereotyping, which is that when I initially started this work and I wasn't quite known, many people wrote me and they always addressed me as Mr. Alaka. The assumption was that the person who headed an organization as strong as mine really needed to be a man and not a woman. And I think that women who are in executive positions face this a lot of times, where people who have not met you in person just assume that you must be male, except you have a name that is clearly feminine. And this is what the media reflects. So we can say that the media is reflecting society because there are not so many women who are leaders of this kind of roles. However, the media does need to do more than reflect society. The media can frame society. The media can set the agenda for society, can help the society behave like it should, really. In the WSCIJ, we've done a couple of media monitoring programs, and what we find is our most recent data, which we collected last year during COVID, out of 14 national newspapers, and we saw 35,182 stories. And of these stories, we found 5,620 that were about girls and women. While entertainment at 17%, the combination of education and health on coverage of women issues at 9%. So you would find that a lot of times when there's stories of girls and women covered, they're mostly victim stories, and they are not the heroes of the story, or basically when they are heroes, they are mostly men. And like you said, what we found about sources clearly is that most of the voices are actually male voices, and the difference is what you said, which is what I campaign. The difference is intentionality. So I have found that really there is nobody really working hard to ensure that the voices of female persons are not heard in the news and in the newsrooms. But that is exactly the problem. There's also nobody that is working intentionally hard to ensure that the voices of female persons are heard in the newsroom. So when we switch the attention we can make a lot of difference. I will end there for now.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question because you've worked with 700 some women journalists. Do you feel that this kind of training is somehow reshaping the thinking in the newsroom at all, or are they still at such a low level that they don't have the agenda setting function of senior management?
The training is making tremendous difference. Tremendous difference. We've seen that it is assumed that when a woman holds a leadership position, that things would automatically change. My experience is that it is not necessarily so. However, when you train, when you improve the capacity of the women that are going to hold leadership position or that are in newsrooms to understand the access that they have and the power of that access and what they can do with that power, then the dynamics totally change. We have what I call an army of 53 fellows from our Female Reporters Leadership Program, and they're changing things in their newsrooms. They are actually influencing some board appointments. They're influencing how their colleagues write stories. Many of them are resource persons in their own newsrooms to their colleagues on finding right sources that are female in technical issues or art stories, things that are considered art stories like politics, government, aviation, and the rest.
I'd like to be able to explore those lessons learned in the next question, because I think what we can learn from that experience, I think, would be very, very valuable. Let me move on to Brian Pellet. Brian is a journalist and Taboom Media's co-founding director. He regularly speaks about LGBTQI rights at media and human rights conferences around the world, and he occasionally freelances for international news outlets as well. Brian, you're the only male on the panel. So talk about why this topic is of importance to you personally, and also tell us a little bit more about Taboom, just very briefly.
Sure. Thanks, Joyce, and the other panelists and organizers. I'll be expanding the definition of gender in this conversation. So we often think of gender as men and women, girls and boys, but the communities we work with go beyond that. So gender diverse people, gender nonconforming, transgender, and gender stereotyping doesn't only affect people who identify in a certain way, it also affects people based on how they express their gender. So a person who identifies as a man and was assigned male at birth, but perhaps acts a bit more effeminately, or a woman who presents more masculinely, can also be gender stereotyped negatively. And those are the issues that we work on at Taboom Media. We work with journalists all around the world, specifically on improving coverage of gender and sexual minorities. And whether or not someone is out, open about their gender or sexuality, whether or not they're forcibly outed in the media, which we often see happen, which is one of the many, many issues we see facing gender and sexual minorities. They're stereotyped for who they are, who they love, how they behave, and all manners of things. So I think I'd like to share a few examples. We work with journalists, we work with activists, and we had an activist workshop in early January where we were working with 24 activists from all over sub-Saharan Africa on how they could better get their messages into the mainstream media, and also how they can tell their own stories via social media. And in that week alone, we had 3 examples of media storms
Brian, excuse me, is this on basically what we need to do to fix it? These
I just want to share some personal experiences,
okay, fine. Sure.
From some of the activists we work with. So in January in Zambia, there was a big media storm. It ran on most of the newspapers with headlines like "Unmasked COVID-19 Aid for Zambian Gays." Zambia has been targeted with funding to promote homosexual and related activities amid the pandemic. So this type of fear-mongering, this hostile reporting, heightens negative tensions. We saw the same thing in Ghana that same week. An LGBT center opened and was attacked by the president, by media representatives. And then the flip side of that, in Liberia, we learned about the case of a man who had tortured 27 gay men, stolen their phones, their Facebook accounts, and basically no media was reporting on this. So we see both things. We see terrible coverage and we see complete underreporting. And part of what makes that so difficult is because it's illegal to transgress to not be straight, to not be gender conforming in about 70 countries. So it's difficult for people to speak out, to speak openly about their existences. And all the issues that the other panelists and that you, Joyce, mentioned about representation in the newsroom. It's very rare that someone would be out in a place where it's illegal to be open about who you are. So we don't have the media creators. People aren't being interviewed as expert sources or even as sources of their communities. And the subjects aren't being covered. And when they are covered, they're being covered in ways that is dangerous. So later on, I will talk about some of the things that we're doing in terms of working with activists to be proactive and get better reporting out, but also reactive when things take a negative turn, as they unfortunately so often do.
Thank you, Brian. That's, I have to say, so very disheartening. So I look forward to hearing some ways we can push ahead, particularly challenging when all of this is considered illegal and how you speak up and make this point in countries. So there's maybe a clear division between certain countries that have it illegal and others who don't, but I don't know, you can talk about that as we move on. But that was very sobering and actually quite heartbreaking too. Melanie Tobel is the founder and director of Publicitarias, a nonprofit organization that promotes diversity and gender perspective in advertising agencies in Argentina. She worked earlier in her career as a creative director, and she brings that perspective of a different type of media, which is advertising. So Melanie, within the advertising world, gender stereotyping is, of course, a huge issue, and we're going to dive into what can be done later. But tell us what your own experiences and challenges in dealing with the issue in advertising.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Joyce. As you said, I think we can all agree that advertising is one of the main industries responsible for creating and promoting gender stereotypes. And people see ads all of their lives, 24 hours a day, everywhere, when scrolling in social media, when walking down the street, when watching TV, or when they are listening to the radio. Everybody has seen sexist or discriminating ads and probably thought, who is still creating this kind of ads? Well, the answer won't surprise you. Advertising is almost exclusively led by white middle-aged men with class privilege. And in Argentina, only 8% of creative directors are female. I was one of them. In 2015, I worked as a creative director in an advertising agency, and I got invited to be a jury member at a renowned advertising festival. That day when arriving, I noticed that I was the only woman within a group of 17 men. And it was a turning point for me because I was shocked because I didn't only see clearly the lack of representation, but also because it made me have a flashback to professors saying all kinds of stereotypical stuff like women can be funny, bosses ordering HR not to hire an accountant because, quote, she wasn't hot enough, and how my female colleagues were always complaining they only got to work with fashion and beauty brands, but never got the opportunity to create car or beer commercials. So I created Publicitarias with two main goals: more diversity in the teams and more gender perspective in the work. And turned out to be that Publicitarias was the first Latin American community that reunited women and LGBTQI people who work in advertising, marketing, design, and communications. And since then, we've been fighting against gender stereotypes every day. From being the first advertising media outlet with gender perspective to creating events, a mentorship program, workshops, and developing collaborative tools. Last year, we launched Perspectiva Género, this card kit that allows teams, professionals, and students to identify gender stereotypes in their ideas and to think outside the sexist box. And this year, we are finishing the beta version of Sello Púrpura, a certification in gender perspective for Latin American advertising agencies, a program that includes a diagnosis of the equality status in each agency, workshop sessions, evaluation, and being part of a directory of agencies that have the compromise of eliminating gender stereotypes, symbolic violence, and promoting diversity. And Publicitarias has grown so much since we started, and growth sounds amazing, but it's not easy to manage. Now we are working hard to be sustainable, following an action plan to turn this community of volunteers into a fully functional NGO and media, because we had a lot of purpose and heart, but all these years we need a structure and funds to survive, basically. And that's one of the biggest challenges feminist organizations like us have to face. And as a creative professional, besides Publicitarias, now I'm also a co-founder of Hermana, as you said, the first Argentine agency created from a gender perspective. And we also always work on campaigns focused on promoting diversity and eliminating gender stereotypes. And I created Acabar, also a documentary podcast about sexuality that seeks to close the orgasm gap and educate in a diverse way. And Acabar is a success story because it's the most popular podcast in Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. It's one of the most popular. And I think a lot of things have changed since 2015, and now the communication industry is talking about diversity and gender a lot. Brands are asking their agencies to hire more women, and people have the power to create enormous reputational crises in social media. But what concerns me the most is that we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg. We think basic things like red color menstruation, women drinking beer, or women driving cars are revolutionary things, when most of the ads are still reproducing gender stereotypes, invisibilizing all types of bodies, invisibilizing gender identities and colors, and showing toxic masculinity. Like Brian said, gender is not only about women, and gender perspective isn't either. And inside the agencies, the numbers are practically not moving. There are no real policies towards gender equality or protocols to stop harassment being applied. So we need a deeper understanding of this topic and start to be aware of the responsibility the advertising industry has in gender stereotyping. And not only the agencies, because I invite you to think that for an ad to be online, you need a brand that approves the content, but also media companies that allow and show it. And I would love this panel to be an opportunity to think about the entire chain of approval from top to bottom.
Thank you. That was very also incredibly enlightening and informative. Did the Me Too movement have any effect at all on the advertising world in Argentina?
Yes, it had, but I think it especially had an effect in Mexico. We have ambassadors in Mexico, in Chile, in Peru, in Guatemala, and the effect there was harder than in Argentina for the advertising industry. Now, I say harder for the industry, but it's better for us, the women. But here in Argentina, I think we still need to have the conversation about harassment inside the agencies.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much, Melanie. And Victoria Sandino is a journalist, an ex-FARC commander, and current Colombian senator. She was a communist militant, which led to persecution and violence for her family. Shortly after, she joined FARC, where she became an important actor and player in the peace talks. She committed herself to bringing the issue of gender to the negotiating table and led the Gender Commission in charge of mainstreaming a gender approach. She is currently a senator where she works for gender equality. Victoria, and make sure you have your interpretation on, please. You've been working with gender and gender stereotypes from all different angles. Tell us about your personal experience.
Muchas gracias por esta invitación. Saludes. Yo quisiera plantear, porque he escuchado de manera atenta cada una de las intervenciones y lo importante de todo esto es que son distintos contextos, pero los estereotipos pues se reproducen porque pertenece a un sistema como el sistema patriarcal que nos afecta a todas y a todos. En el caso de mi experiencia personal, tenemos, yo quisiera, tal como lo presentó Jack, yo soy periodista de formación y era militante activista. Me fui a la guerra, o sea, me incorporé a la insurgencia y claro, con una mirada, cómo se siente el tema de cómo se ve la noticia desde adentro, ¿no? Digo yo desde adentro o desde afuera o desde la montaña donde me encontraba. Cómo se trataba la noticia en el contexto de la guerra y también con respecto al tema de los estereotipos. Y esto es parejo, lamentablemente. Es decir, hombres y mujeres tienen, periodistas tienen un tratamiento hacia las mujeres en el contexto de la guerra bastante estigmatizador, se estigmatiza mucho, se maltrata mucho a la persona. Y eso fue, repito, en el contexto de la guerra, pero en la mesa de negociaciones, el primer impacto fue cuando yo llego, ya estaban mis compañeras allí, en una delegación de 30 personas, en la mesa de negociadores, prácticamente no había sino una sola mujer, que yo llego y ella sale, o sea, ella renuncia y entro yo a la mesa de negociaciones y lo más duro para todas mis compañeras que estaban en la delegación de paz fue los insultos, la estigmatización, los señalamientos, incluso mucho más fuerte hacia las mujeres guerrilleras en ese momento que hacia los comandantes que estaban en la mesa. Así que esa fue una de las principales motivaciones que nos llevó y que me llevó a mí a trabajar por el enfoque de género en el acuerdo de paz.
Thank you. From that perspective, it's quite interesting, and I think we do see a universality of the programs of the issue across the board here as well. So I agree with you. I'm going to move on to our next series of questions on the role the media can play. As I mentioned, the Commission on the Status of Media will accept agreed conclusions or recommendations that state that gendered stereotyping can prevent and undermine women and girls' enjoyment of their full and effective participation in public life. They explicitly state that gender stereotypes can be reinforced by media and stress the important role that media can play in creating gender-sensitive coverage. So this question is not a new issue. There are some new dimensions to this issue. I guess, what do we do about it? What can we achieve? What does the news media need to do to fundamentally change its message about women and underrepresented people in this world? And, maybe I'll ask Monturayo to start us off, because you're close to a newsroom perspective. And then please, I really think it's important that all of you talk very concretely about what you think can be done, because it is time to take action with a problem that's been around way, way too long. So kick us off, Monturayo.
Thank you, Joyce. I'll just mention perhaps 3 or 4 recommendations. The first thing I think really is that the newsroom needs to get an education. And when I say that, often people are shocked because we expect that the newsroom knows. But I found that the newsroom does not always know. The newsroom needs to get, the media needs to get more educated so that it understands the issues it is dealing with. Often the media pursues stories because it wants to meet a deadline. And so there is not too much time to learn the nuances of the issue. So I really believe that there's a need to learn and understand the nuances and the issues as they affect them, understanding that we are all products of sociology. And so even as a journalist, you have biases and you just need to learn to be able to get above them. Another very important thing is about—
Let me just follow up on that.
Yes.
How do you get that done? If you basically said that newsrooms are very busy, they're churning out the news, they're on autopilot, doing the things they've always done, and they need an education. What gets them, what's the motivation for them to seek outside training? I'm assuming that's what you think when you say get an education.
Yes, so I would say that generally there is no motivation internally. What we have done is to pick people from the newsroom and orientate them. And when they return to the newsroom, they are different people. They are people who can mobilize change and who can influence others to also learn. And because they know they can tell others. What we have also done is to go and sit with media owners and media managers to explain the issues to them, the ethics of gender balance in terms of representations of girls and women, the economics of it, even for sustainability of the media, because if half your readers are female, but you just want to write for the male, then who buys what you're writing? Who is going to be interested? And like we see, most of the major media houses, most of their audiences are male because they do not have content that the female will be interested in, or they have not presented news in a way that has given voice to the female person. So that takes us easily to the sources issue, which we had mentioned over and over again.
Yeah, you had some other points besides the newsroom education. Don't let me stop you. What were the other two?
Okay, so I wanted to talk about sources. The fact that the media generally has a penchant for repeating sources, and I understand it's because we're on the deadline. So if there's somebody we already have their number and there's a transportation issue, we just call that person up and hear the person. But the media, I always say, can also make newsmakers. The media can make newsmakers. So the media has the duty to keep a diary of people across, and in this regard, female persons who are experts in all fields. My organization, the Wole Soyinka Center for Investigative Journalism, is working with partners to do this for Nigeria and perhaps the wider continent, to come up with a source guide, that has the various names and links to female persons who are experts, so that when there are issues, we can recommend who to speak to. And many of our fellows are already doing this in their newsrooms. They tell their colleagues, oh, I know somebody in oil and gas that is female that can speak to you rather than the man you have been interviewing for 7 years. So we can make this kind of change also. I'll stop there so that others can speak to it.
Okay, that was very, very, very useful. Two excellent suggestions. Melanie, you want to talk a little bit about the changes in advertising and what needs to be done? And then, I know that Brian wants to weigh in. So why don't you take it from here, Melanie, and then we'll go to Brian.
Okay, what I've seen is that inside the teams, people think that gender perspective is something, it's like a trend they can easily learn, and they want magic solutions like a checklist or a quick workshop or a quick talk. And gender issues are very complex. Violence is complex. Gender stereotypes are complex, and we need a deeper understanding of them. And what I've learned from people is that people, they don't have even the basics. So some people, they don't even know what a gender stereotype is. So I think we need to start from the basics and be creative. And mostly we need to speak the language of the people. We in Publicitarias, we developed these cards, and as you can see, they have cute little illustrations, and they have open questions. It's almost like kindergartenish, and they are a success in introducing teams into gender stereotypes. We've been working with almost like 50 companies with them, and also at the agency we created a campaign called the Helpers, los ayudadores, about men who are always asking, how can I help, instead of doing domestic tasks themselves. And it went viral. And the learning from that is that we use humor, and it was amazing how even the most difficult targets engaged. I think advertising, it was so creative in creating and spreading gender stereotypes and violence, and it also can be an amazing tool to help to heal the world. It hurts me so much when I see all these wonderful papers, investigations, and proposals from international organizations and activists that won't ever be seen by the general public because it's just another language. And the best thing we can learn from the advertising is that we can innovate and find many creative ways to communicate.
Thank you. Both you and Munchen Rayo have this strong emphasis on training so that people understand the problem more deeply so that they can deal with it. I also think you both sort of touched on it, and I know Munchen Rayo did. There's an economic reason to do this. If you are excluding 50% of your audience at a time when news organizations are struggling, many are struggling financially, and I'm sure the advertising world could be more lucrative as well. There's a bottom line reason to be able to be more sensitive to your audiences and be able to talk to your audiences in ways that are more meaningful. So I think the sustainability argument is something that is a very good way to convince news leaders and owners that they ought to take action, because it is a bottom line issue. But that's not my 2 cents. Brian, why don't you take it from here? And thank you, Melanie, for those suggestions.
I'd also say education is key, especially when we're talking about LGBTQI communities. Everyone has met a woman in their life. They know women, but the same is not necessarily true for sexual and gender minorities. Pretty much everyone probably knows a sexual or gender minority, but whether or not they know someone who is open about that fact is very unlikely in a lot of places. So with journalists, the bar is much lower. It's about learning basic terminology, but then also the safety issues that come with interviewing sources and with even covering these issues. So it's a lot of issues that journalists have to factor in around consent, informed consent in their reporting, around anonymity when necessary. We work in very difficult places where that's extremely important. So education is key, but then I think it's both sides. Journalists need to educate themselves, but it's also people, human rights defenders, to help educate the journalists, and then to even just bypass the media, the traditional news media, I should say, creating your own media content, getting your own stories out, because we can't rely on news media to tell our stories in many places. So we can just bypass them and tell our own stories, and then engage with journalists in meaningful ways where we can get some more pickup, be that press releases, doing interviews and preparing for those sorts of things. So creating your own media.
Are you seeing the rise of independent news sources on the subject of gender in around the world, particularly in countries where it's illegal? Are you seeing those voices crop up and speak out?
Absolutely. And one that I'll mention, when I mentioned the Liberia case, the horrible case in Liberia earlier, where there's almost no coverage of this attack and assault on an entire community. Boko Stewart started his own media organization called Journal Rage, and he's been covering this in a serialized way for, I think, 8 stories on this issue. So that's how we know about it. We need that sort of community-based reporting to cover these issues. And we are seeing that in some countries, and globally, there's a few news sources. But it's that sort of news coverage that I think is really key, rather than just the activists putting up things on their Instagram, actually covering the issues, because that's the way that we can keep track of these. And then, as I was saying, so we have a media monitoring, Taboom has a media monitoring and response coalition where all of the activists that are part of our network track news media coverage of LGBTQI communities. And then rather than just tracking them as a database, we reach out and we respond. So if it's excellent coverage, thank the journalist, suggest your organization as a source for future coverage that can provide more good reporting, essentially, fair, accurate reporting. And if it's a terrible story, reach out the same way to the journalist, but maybe it involves, if it's hate speech that's inciting violence, it's looking at the laws in your country and seeing what's even legal. So we really push and encourage media self-regulation, but sometimes when things just get completely off the rails and lives are at stake, there needs to be some regulatory body to intercede.
Yes, that's incredibly important. Brian, I wanted to ask whether there's any country or news organization that you think is setting the gold standard here.
In terms of reporting on?
In terms of doing good reporting on an issue where a lot of people are quite ignorant about the topic even.
Well, it's sort of country by country, I'd say. In terms of a global, I mean, openly, so that's the Thomson Reuters Foundation. They launched an entire LGBTQI vertical 2-3 years ago, I think. So they've been covering the issues very well. And that's the Thomson Reuters Foundation. So it's Reuters content, that's news, mainstream news content. But then a lot of the excellent content is, it's more community-based, community originating.
Okay, let's move to our next question, which is about regulation or self-regulation, or what needs to be done on a policy level. Another agreed conclusion from the CSW underscores the need to adopt appropriate measures, including awareness-raising measures to eliminate prejudice and address gender stereotypes, and to implement appropriate policies that are aimed at transforming discriminatory social attitudes. So, Chiara, let's go to you, since you're at the EU. We know that you had a gender action plan and a gender equality strategy, but from your work as the head of the Gender, Human Rights and Democratic Governance Unit, what needs to be done to change the status quo?
Thank you. I would have liked to intervene on the training and the support, because just before we go into possible regulations, just to underscore what you rightly mentioned, that changes need to come from within, from the media, from the communities, but of course we can play a positive role in supporting this and providing incentive for this to be prioritized. Direct our funding in a way that there is a clear incentive also to take up trainings for developing ethical standards, gender sensitive reporting, training of journalists in this context. So that's what we do a lot in a number of places. And to bring the example of the internal to the European Union, we have this big program called Creative Europe Media Program. So for the next 7 years, media intends to ensure that those who request Creative Europe funds commit to gender equality in their company strategies. Just to give you an example of another lever that you can use to push for change in a way. Now, in terms of the regulation, self-regulation, how to go about it, it's certainly a complex debate and a delicate one, because we need to make sure that when different human rights are at play, we are not conflicting, and we are not diminishing unduly freedom of expression, for instance, for the sake of protecting, for instance, equality and avoid discrimination on different grounds. But there are ways of going about it. One example, we introduced back in 2018 in Europe, a audiovisual media service directive. And this directive imposed on our EU member states, European Union member states, to ensure that broadcasts do not contain content which incites to hatred and violence on grounds of race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, including. So that's one way to go about it that we have been testing, and we are also considering for the end of this year, we are undergoing an impact assessment. We are considering to introduce a new, the harmonization of a new crime at the European level. And it's really about introducing common sanctions and a common definition for hate crimes. So, you know, misogynist hate speech, which incites violence, which incites to rape, you know, and making sure that this doesn't go unpunished, that sanctions are deterrent for these crimes to happen. And similarly, we're also thinking about legislation on gender-based violence. So this is about what is happening in the EU. And of course, every context is different. So it's not a catch-all solution.
Yes, that's interesting how you can use your funding to promote change, and that could be very effective. I agree. Let me turn to Victoria, because she is a Colombian senator, and let's talk about regulatory moves that you are encouraging. I have to say, as a journalist, anytime you hear regulation, it sends chills up your spine, because you'd much rather have self-regulation rather than the government telling you what you can or can't write about. So my knee-jerk reaction is not to be regulating content, so to speak, but I understand, of course, if it's hate speech, and there has to be some way to stop some very nefarious trends, and they are getting increasingly ugly on the internet in particular. But Colombia, so let me go back to Colombia and Victoria and see what the perspective is from your country.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. De nuevo, mire, creo que tenemos que partir del contexto del conflicto, de un conflicto armado que lleva muchísimas décadas en nuestro país, y que eso exacerba aún más el tema de estos estereotipos, de las violencias, porque los estereotipos ¿a dónde conducen? También a un ejercicio de violencias contra las diversidades y contra las mujeres. Entonces, yo estoy de acuerdo que no se trata de una regulación en términos normativos para impedir o coartar la libertad de expresión o de prensa en nuestro país, pero sí es necesario un marco ético, creo yo, un marco ético incluyente más bien, un marco ético incluyente que nos permita, empezar de alguna manera tanto las propuestas en materia de educación, de formación a los medios y a los y las periodistas, pero también ese marco ético que dé un alcance hacia el tratamiento que debe tener la información, no solamente el tema de la noticia como tal, sino la información de manera específica. Y quisiera también expresar que de lo primero que estaban discutiendo o interviniendo es que aquí se necesita una voluntad explícita, manifiesta de los dueños, digo yo de los dueños, porque conozco, en Colombia no conozco dueñas o mujeres que sean dueñas de medios de comunicación. Realmente son los dueños, grandes conglomerados económicos, los que manejan aquí la comunicación y la información. Y en ese sentido se necesita, insisto, esa voluntad. Y esa voluntad del manejo de la información, del lenguaje, de la eliminación de esos estereotipos, de la situación, de permitir que haya si se puede decir, una cuota de mujeres o de diversidades en el manejo de la información, o sea, periodistas que estén en los medios con esas características. Y finalmente, por supuesto, no es suficiente la cuota, sino que se requiere también que haya una formación y una disposición de identidad con estas diversidades, con los temas de las mujeres, para que el tratamiento sea efectivamente distinto, porque de lo que decía yo ahorita en la experiencia, pues muchos de los ataques han venido incluso de mujeres periodistas, incluso más que de los hombres.
That's that's a very disturbing trend. I think we can open the floor to questions from our audience. I have a few here that I'm going to look at. We have there's a big issue of the rise in the number of women journalists around the world, the number of women in journalism schools as well. But the fact is, the leadership is still male dominated. And how do you crack that nut? How do you make that change if the leadership remains predominantly men? Who wants to take that? Just raise your hand or.
Okay, I can attempt that. I think that it is important to clear that this is not just a media issue. This is across all sectors. So when we started the Report Women program in 2014, we wanted to check the status of leadership of female persons in the newsroom in Nigeria. And what we found in the newsroom as at that time, and a lot has changed since then, is that when you look at the senior editors ratio, the leadership is ratio 8:2 in favor of men. When you look at the organization's management, media organizations management team, the ratio is 10:2. When you look at the board of directors of media organization, the ratio was 7:2, all in favor of men. However, when we also checked, global statistics of female leadership in businesses, you realize that at entry point, you have up to 53% who were women. By mid-level, we have about 40%, and by director level, you have about 35%. And the source here is Harvard Business Review. So this is a general issue across sector that we experience, that there'll be more women at entry levels, and the higher you go, the more the women drop off. And when we tried to search why do the women drop off, at the center of many of these issues is culture, is the fact that there is an expectation of the female person, and there's an expectation of society of the male person, and those expectations soon get the women out of the system. So while she is struggling with the same job, she also has a full-time job unpaid that is at home. And so there is no way to balance those lives and be as effective as she wants to be. So that is the reality of the world that we are in now, whether in media or really outside the media.
So what do you do about it?
So what we do about it is, again, capacity development. Like Victoria was mentioning, it's not just, if you're getting attacks from women, it is not just the fact that we get more women in the spaces that is important. It is that the women that we're getting into the spaces must have the right understanding of what they are going into those spaces to do and what powers they have. And they must be reorientated to understand, what you need to change. And you can also have male men who are interested in this change, like we have seen. A lot of men who are also able to be change makers in this regard. Ownership of media houses by female persons, again, who understand the issues, is also very important. We found that helps. They are going to program in a different way. They are going to frame in a different way. They are going to staff in a different way. The agenda is just different. When they understand, when they do not understand it, it's a loss. really generally, whether they are male or female, it doesn't matter. So it is to get media owners to understand the need for balance in terms of representation of male and female persons in whether the newsroom or outside the newsroom. The advantage of the media, sorry, Joyce, the advantage of the media is that it does beyond just taking care of itself. It can take care of the rest of society too. And that is why it is important to get the media right so that we can help the rest of society.
I just wanted to follow up with one more question about, do you see changes in the young generation that are they more open and more progressive in their thoughts about this issue in Nigeria?
Well, I doubt that what we're dealing with, I mean, my experience, I doubt that it is just about age. For some issues, for instance, that have to be with the rights of women in Nigeria, it is actually worse down the line, because unlike the generation of African mothers who all they had to do was sit at home, and even outside Africa, it's a global issue. They had to sit at home and take care of the home. They did not have to work. But this generation of women, they have to work. But society still expects them to do exactly what their mothers were doing, you know, take care of everything that their mother was doing. So it can be more brutal even for the younger generation. It can be better. I think really the art of it is the understanding of the rights of men and women in society.
Okay. Anybody else want to pipe in on the question? Yes, Melanie. And Brian.
What I have found is, as you said before, there's a huge opportunity. And there are a lot of consumers, and I'm speaking about advertising consumers, but also media consumers, and that they are not having what they want. And if men are not giving us the space, we have the opportunity to create our own media. I have met women who own media in Colombia, for example, Agenda Propia. And I was part of the Metis program from Sembra Media, and I have met a lot of women who founded their own media. And with the internet, we have the opportunity to create our own space and to speak about what we want, and we have the power to grow and even grow more than the traditional media. Publicitarias has grown so much these years, and now we are bigger than a lot of the media that advertising had before, and the media that showed always men and always lacked the representation of women, and now we are bigger than them. So we can achieve that. We have the tools.
Brian, did you want to add to that?
I just wanted to add, you asked if it's getting better among the youth, and specifically to the question of LGBT issues in Africa, mostly where we work. A poll just came out earlier this month that found only 21% of people aged 18 to 25 would not mind having a gay neighbor, and that's compared with about 17% of people over 66. So here it's really not getting better, which is why this work is so important, because the public perception is still such a problem in so many places.
I have another question from the audience. There is no catch-all solution, Chiara said. How do we deal with regional and cultural issues that play a role in gender stereotyping? Are there some elements in gender stereotyping that are globally true or universally true?
Well, yeah, I think that in many respects, gender discrimination and the triggers for gender discrimination can be seen at the global level. Then they translate in each and every culture, but you can find them all over the world. And how do we go about it? It also allows me to continue the discourse on youth, which because I think I have to disagree with Brian on this one. If I take, I'm working on preventing and combating violence against women and girls in Africa and Latin America, in Asia, Pacific, and so on. And what we see is that a lot of the change, not all the change, but a lot of the change is brought forward by youth, by boys and girls. I mean, that generation, which is really starting to say no, for instance, to FGM, feminine genital mutilation, or to girls' marriage, and they kind of drive and bring a change then within their families, and that's how it starts. That's how I think communities really go about in changing and bringing gender equality. I mean, I have so many examples, of incredible boys and girls who changed the law in their country, in the Gambia, in many other places. And then, of course, it's more complex than that. It's also about working with the religious leaders and really working within, once again, that community. Takes time, but it brings fruit, and I'm very hopeful of this generation worldwide.
Did you want to? I'm glad to hear something positive as well. And it probably does depend on the type of the problem that maybe we're addressing as well. But did you want to address the issue of what's universal and what's regional, and how do we deal with the kind of diverse circumstances we're coping with in different places of the world?
Well, I think that human rights are universal. Huh? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says it all. Then, of course, countries have taken different commitments, but most of our countries, they do subscribe to the Agenda 2030, to the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals are essentially 90% human rights goals. So, I think one way to go about it is really to look from also from that perspective, and looking at our own national frameworks and legislation that just include these international commitments. So sorry, I'm too legal now, and I have total sun, so I don't see you anymore. I have to buy some stores at some point. But yeah, that would be the short answer, that some right. Things are just universal.
Here's a question. Women not only face harassment and stereotyping, but often are the victims of journalistic breaches, such as plagiarism from male colleagues. I wasn't aware that this was a gender issue, to be perfectly honest, so it's interesting for me to learn. And I'm sure our speakers can tell us more. How should women journalists deal with these acts that are both illegal and violate the journalism code of ethics? Volunteers? No? No takers on that question?
Okay. Go ahead, Melanie.
No, I was going to speak from the advertising industry, but I think you are going to give a
¿Cuál es la pregunta que hace?
view right for this question.
So I would say that let's just take it up the way we would take any, plagiarism issue up, because that's sometimes the danger, to just label it a women issue rather than a criminal issue or an illegal issue. So it is illegal. So let's take it up that way, to say that I was plagiarized and I need redress for this, following the right course, not because I'm a woman, but because I own the rights to this.
Right. So you don't see it as a gender issue, just as an ethics issue.
No, I do see that people get plagiarized. So my husband writes, he writes sports,
sure.
And he shows me websites where people have lifted his whole story and puts their name on it. So it's something that happens to writers all over. I
Right.
just think we lose the battle if we just focus on the gender issue rather than focus on the fact that a content was stolen.
Exactly. What did you want to add, Melanie?
I was going to say that I think it is a gender issue because what I've seen lately is that men are usually intellectually using us. They are always asking our opinions about a gender perspective in this coverage, a gender perspective in this commercial, and they are always acting it like it is only an opinion, and they are using our thoughts in their work, and they are getting the credit for it. So I think it is a gender issue.
Thank you. I have another interesting question here because one of the trends that we've talked about is creating more independent voices in the news media and in the advertising space to challenge traditional media. Is there a culture of public support for independent media that does not accept corporate advertising in your various regions? Do you see that trend of public interest media or nonprofit media flourishing to produce more independent coverage on issues of gender and the like? Anybody like to take that question?
Yo creo que sí. O sea, quería, vuelve y juega, a ponerme desde el contexto colombiano, ¿no? Hay una situación que en Colombia hay un enorme monopolio, digámoslo así, en torno a los grandes medios de comunicación. Es cierto que se ha proliferado de alguna manera los medios virtuales, las redes sociales y distintas expresiones, ¿no? Revistas, portales virtuales, pero también hay una realidad en Colombia y es que pues es un país bastante pobre y afectado por la violencia. No hay una cobertura nacional, digámoslo así, no hay una cobertura del Internet, por ejemplo, no existe esta cobertura en todo el territorio, por lo tanto, no es muy factible que mucha gente pueda acudir a las redes o a los medios virtuales. Entonces, allí hay una situación muy particular. Y frente a lo que estaban diciendo ahorita, me parece bien interesante señalar que yo sí creo que hay esperanza en términos de que la juventud y los y las nuevas periodistas y gente que ejerce la labor de comunicación creo que han venido moderando han venido cambiando, porque efectivamente este es un asunto cultural. Y bueno, hay más medios, hay más apertura, y creo que el tema de la estigmatización y de los estereotipos tienden a ceder la línea en términos de que es posible transformarlo. Pero insisto, no depende únicamente de los periodistas, de las periodistas, sino de los grandes dueños que marcan una línea, cuál es la que debe seguir el medio.
This is a follow-up question for you, in particular, Victoria. You said that in Colombia, as you just said, all of the media owners are men. How do you, from the journalist and regulation experience, suggest that we change that? Do you think there should be regulation, for example, that would require a quota in newsrooms for women participation?
Sí, justamente hablaba de eso, ¿no? El tema de los dueños es porque pues, son grandes conglomerados económicos. Yo hablo de los grandes medios de comunicación. En el caso de quienes dirigen o quienes están en las salas de redacción, hay una cuestión que incide mucho. Por ejemplo, en Colombia está un medio que es radial muy fuerte, que se llama RCN, no sé si está bien mencionarlo, pero lo que quiero decir es que allí hay una mujer que dirige la conducción de esas noticias. A pesar de que este medio es un medio bastante de derecha, aquí hay que hablar también de las visiones políticas que tienen los medios de comunicación. Y este es un medio particularmente de derecha, bien derecha en este país. Y sin embargo, hay una mujer dirigiendo y esa mujer tiene un tratamiento distinto de la información con respecto a los que ejercen muchos hombres en nuestro país. Estoy hablando de las noticias de la mañana en este medio. Y definitivamente sí creo que, por eso hablábamos de la cuota ahorita, que debe existir una mínima regulación en que no solamente las mujeres estén en las salas de redacción, sino que dirijan esas salas. Ya decía Melanie que cada vez hay más personas en las mujeres siempre son consultadas, pero la vocería la llevan los hombres. Entonces, por eso se requiere de que esas direcciones también estén en manos de mujeres, por ejemplo.
Yes, Soraya, you want to?
Yes, Joyce, I just wanted to add to what Victoria had said. So I believe in regulations. I think that regulations are fantastic to make changes, but I also think that they are long-term, very long routes to the change that we seek. So many of the Guild of Editors in countries are mainly men's club. They're mainly men's club because most of the editors-in-chief are male. So I'll say, let a few people put resources together and start a media house that the editor-in-chief is female or director, and we get a female person right in the room as a member of the Guild of Editors because she is an editor. So yes, regulation is great, but I also think that intentionally we can do things that, you know, immediately just change the face of what we're looking at and help us to move forward.
One of the questions that I have here is that even if women get up to the top levels in media or in ad agencies, how can they stay away from reproducing or getting sucked into the traditional practices or patriarchal practices, as this questioner says, of the systems they're in, and basically fight for a position of change? It's rather difficult, and I'd like to hear your perspective on whether it's been done and how has it been done successfully, or what are the challenges here? Melanie, do you want to start us off on that?
Men and women and every gender identity are born in the same society. So we can expect a woman just to be a woman and for that to have gender perspective. So everybody needs trainings. And I think here in Argentina, we have an example that can be a great regulation if we apply it to the media and advertising. It's not happening in media and advertising, but I think it will be great. The government implemented Micaela's law, and that's a law that asks, it implements a mandatory training for about gender perspective, diversity, and violence to every person working in the state. So they have to do a mandatory training about gender perspective. And I think it will be great if we can have a regulation like that applied to the media and the advertising agencies, and also the marketing departments of the brands. And it will be great if everybody can have a training. So in that way, we ensure that we are not reproducing gender stereotypes, even if we are women or men or every gender identity.
Thank you. Anybody want to add to that?
Just to say that a network can help. We have realized that bringing together a network of female persons who understand the issues together, who support one another. So if the woman who is leading an organization is part of that network, she has a support system, somewhere to go back to say, I can't fix this, what do I do? And she gets supported as to what she can do, how she can go about it, and things get resolved. So networks are helpful.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that too. One of our Knight Fellows in Kenya, Catherine Gishero, is also creating a network of women journalists. And I think that having that support network is really important for success. So my last question, we only have a few more minutes left, and I know it's a sharp cutoff at noon my time, whatever your time is, 6 minutes, let's say. I'd like the speakers just to quickly basically say, what was the most important takeaway from this session that might help counter stereotyping that you heard today? Anyone who can start, and I don't know if we lost Kiara or not. Yeah, go ahead, Victoria.
Aquí estoy. Gracias, muy amable. Mire, yo creo que el mensaje más potente es que este es un asunto global. O sea, es una realidad que nos compete, nos interpela a toda la gente en el mundo. Segundo, que la manera de transformarla, pues obviamente yo insisto en que comienza por una voluntad política, digámoslo así, desde los medios, de los grandes dueños de comunicación, de la participación mucho más amplia de mujeres, pero también de la formación de todas las personas. Estoy de acuerdo con Melanie en que no es solamente formar a hombres o formar a mujeres o a diversidades, no, de todas las personas frente a un tratamiento, pues un tratamiento seguro, respetuoso hacia las personas, hacia las mujeres, hacia las diversidades, en definitiva que nos conduzcan a eliminar esos estereotipos que son tan potentes aún en el mundo. Y gracias.
Thank you. I only have a few minutes left, so Brian?
I think it's the point of education that's come up a few times. So often journalists aren't even aware of their biases, and this cuts across women, girls, gender, LGBTQI issues. And by reproducing these gendered stereotypes in their media coverage, they're essentially telling their audience they can be this or they can be that, and they must follow one of these two paths. And that's just deceptive. It's bad journalism because that's not capturing the diversity of the human experience or of what it means to be a woman or a man or a human or transgender. So I think just that education point is key, and it's key to helping journalists do better.
Thank you. Mucharayo?
I think that I would follow Victoria's line and say definitely we're dealing with a global issue, and that's both comforting and sad, you know, at the same time, but you know that you have company for the change that you want to make. But for me, it is to be intentional. Women make half the population of the world. It is to be intentional. Like I said, regulations can do it, policies can do it, but the things that we can change right near us, why don't we go ahead and just change them right away so that we can begin to see the changes that we want.
Thank you. And Melanie?
I think gender stereotypes are a global issue and also a human rights issue. And we can all agree that they are the ground in which violence and inequality start to grow. So we have a lot of wonderful ideas and tools, but I still think that we need the support from the regulations to go further.
Thank you all very much. I think there was a consensus here about what needs to be done and how big the problem is. I want to ask all the speakers if you have resources to make sure that you share it with us, either put it in the chat or share it with GFMD, because we'd love to be able to share those resources with the broader journalism community. And I want to thank you all very much for taking the time to participate today. You did a wonderful job, and I think we all learned a huge amount about the issue and what to do next. So thank you.
Thanks, Joyce.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias,
Joyce.
Tata, y el otro traductor. Bueno.
Y gracias.